This video was originally recorded fall 2018.
Where are you? In which
I'm
universe?
I'm in New Jersey.
Oh, New Jersey. Okay. That's nice.
The
That's very nice.
wilderness of New Jersey.
No. New
And
Jersey.
and you? Where are you?
I'm in Woodstock, New York.
Yeah, okay. Not far.
Actually, literally in a suburb called Shady, which is in Bearsville, which is my favorite.
Bearsville.
Bearsville, right, where there, because we have a lot of black bears here.
Lovely. You actually look like you're sitting on a very comfy couch with lots of pillows.
Yes, I am. I'm very lazy. Very lazy type. Very lazy type. So you are a hero. You're a hardworking hero.
Well, I'm just honored to have been invited to do this. I really am a big fan of yours and of your writing, and have been for many years. So
you're kidding me. So why did you leave General Mills to do this? You know, that's a very interesting change.
well, it wasn't planned, and I like to tell people it certainly was not in the career plan to leave a job that was really considered one of, the plum jobs in my profession. What I was doing was just, I loved it. Honestly, it was intellectually interesting. The people I worked with were really wonderful. So it really began when I like to describe it as the 21st century juggler. So when I was out, they recruited me from here in New Jersey out to Minnesota, my husband, my school-age kids, and I. And so I was out there, and it was just about midway through the year 2000. And so I had school-age kids, and I was married, and I had aging parents, and I was a new vice president at that time. And so I was juggling like crazy, all the balls in the air. And that's what, in my mind, that's what a professional woman had to do. That was simply the way it was. And I think that's still true. I think that's true for men and women. There's a lot of juggling that go on. I think there's maybe a little more for women because they still carry most of the family burden, although that's shifting. Exactly. I think that's still going to be true for a while. But then I was keeping the balls in the air, Bob, more or less, sometimes one with ball, but more or less.
A little bit.
And then one day I was invited to be responsible for a team that would get a large merger through the FTC. My training was on Wall Street as an antitrust lawyer and an FDA lawyer. And so this was a deal, but it turned into being an 18-month horrific, 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, just all of that.
Right. Wow.
And at the end, during that same 18-month period, I would lose, first my mother would pass away, and 6 months later my father. So in this 18-month period, it was this really horrible conflict of professional craziness, personal tragedy, everything all together. And so you can imagine, I wasn't sleeping, I'd lost 20 pounds, I was, but I was doing what we're trained to do, which is you play hurt, you keep going, because what's the alternative? If I didn't get the deal passed, I knew that 10,000 employees were going to lose their job. So for me, that's 10,000 families. And so there was a lot of pressure to just keep going, just plow ahead because there's a lot at stake. 10,000 families, that's a lot of.
This is a General Mills, you mean? This is all General Mills? Wow.
Yes, and we were acquiring Pillsbury. So 10,000 Pillsbury employees, I was told by one of their senior people, would lose their jobs if I couldn't get this through the FTC. So carrying that and the loss, I was very, very, very close to my parents, very tight-knit family. So losing my mother and then my father within 6 months of each other was another just So now it's over, right? So
At that time, when you were going through all of that, were you already involved in meditation?
no.
Not at all. So your meditation was
Nothing.
your work, actually, and your family. Yes, get it.
Yes.
I got it.
Yes.
Wow.
So now we end, and it was that became, unbeknownst to me at the time, but that would become the catalyst for what would send me to a spa called Miraval, where
Oh, yeah.
they were offering a special program that was called an intensive retreat for executives, the power of mindfulness. And at the time, I wasn't willing to go to a spa to relax because that was not my mindset. You know, my mindset was the juggler. But when I saw that they described it as an intensive retreat, well, then it's okay to go to a spa.
Good.
And that was my introduction. It was taught by John Kabat-Zinn, and that was where I was first introduced to mindfulness meditation, 6 days in Arizona desert.
Right.
And, you know, kind of an intensity of John, which was, we started at 6:30 in the morning, we went till 9:30 at night. And I'll share with you that the very first, there were only 13 of us. The very first time, first session, go into this room, there are these weird round cushions on the floor, which to me are like, what are those things? What are you supposed to do with that? Okay. So we go, we sit down on that. And he said, well, we're going to have our first practice. It'll be for about, we're going to sit for about 45 minutes. And I thought, sit and do what for 45 minutes? I'm going to go crazy. You want me to sit here for 45 minutes?
Really?
Now, I have to tell you, it was very much those 6 days, really hard, very painful in lots of ways. It was a lot like hitting a brick wall. And I will tell you that on the very last day, when I was going for a 6:30 practice in the morning, and I was carrying my little Zafu out to the desert where we were going to have our morning practice, and I knew it was just going to be an hour. And the thought in my mind on that very last morning was, it'll never be long enough. Oh my God, it's just an hour. It'll never be long enough. And that's what happened to me in 6 days.
I see. That's amazing. But what happened during the very first session when your mind was rambling here and there and you were told to sit still and watch your breath and the whole thing? What happened then? And how did you get through it? What made you want to get through it? That's so interesting.
My body was, what I remember most was my body was revolting. You know, it was just, it was hurting everywhere. You know, everything felt uncomfortable. I couldn't find a posture that would support me. It was not pleasant. And in fact,
did John make you sit still without moving or shifting? Oh, he did that Zen thing? Oh, really?
Well, I mean,
he wouldn't let you change your position?
He made it clear that you were going to sit a particular way, a particular posture, and that, you know, you shouldn't gut it out. If you were really in a lot of pain, it was okay to adjust, but clearly the intention was to still your body.
Okay. Wow, that's very tough.
It was very, very, very hard, but I'll tell you
for your mindset, it was probably good that you felt very much of a challenge, actually, right? Because you were into like surmounting challenges.
Yeah, I think so. I think that probably there was something around the kind of structure and discipline around it that was probably an okay part of it. But what I really needed to learn was to be gentle and not so much to keep being hard and tough.
Yeah. Oh, good. And you felt in that first 6 days you did that? You came around to a new orientation that way?
Oh, yeah. I think so. I think it was the beginnings. By the end, I was significantly different at the end of 6 days. And in fact, when I came home, my husband met me at the door and gave me a hug. And we talked for just a couple of minutes. And he said, what happened? You know, there's like really different about you. Yeah. It was the first time in a really long time that I remembered again what it was like to be present for any moment of my life.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great.
And it was just a tremendously powerful stuff. Now, I will tell you that I then went back to Minnesota, back to my life, and began my own practice, but felt tremendously alone, right? Because I certainly was a closet meditator at General Mills. I knew for sure they didn't want their senior attorney to be a meditator. That would not have been thought of as a good thing. And so I kept it all under wraps, would do my practice for an hour every day, but pretty quickly, in fact, it would have such a big effect on me, that this feeling of aloneness, that when I began to develop the mindful leadership curriculum, which was years later, it wasn't like I came home and started, it was years later, but it was a lesson that stayed with me, and it is a premise of the work we do now here at the Institute for Mindful Leadership, that we are there for the journey. That is always a part of what we do. So we don't just go in and teach, but we have all kinds of ways that we continue to be there for the journey for anyone who is part of our Institute family.
Right. You mean with people who are your clients, like if a corporation brings you to help their executives to become more present to what they're doing?
Well, they don't do, it's really not so much that as it is, we have offerings that are open to the public. In fact, we teach every year. One of those offerings I teach at Menla. And people come from all around the world. Professionals come from all around the world. Individuals. Also at those, sometimes we'll get a whole team of people. Like we'll have a group of scientists or a group of a leadership team or that kind of, so they'll go through it together. When we do custom work for organizations, sometimes it's leadership, sometimes it's all levels. It can be anything, because our definition of leader, my definition of a leader, leadership to me at its core is just about influence. And so every single person, whether you're talking about leading your own life or your family or a multi-billion-dollar, it's about influence. And the question for me is always, we are always influencing all the time. The question is, for better or worse, we're influencing. Can we more often learn to use these practices to more often influence for better and less often influence for worse?
Of course. Well, you don't think it's automatically for better, more or less? If you're more present and you're more thoughtful about what you're doing, more open, more receptive to things? So I
do. I think that is a potential for being, but I don't think it's quite as simple as that when you're in the midst of the fire of, the gray, the ethical grays, the ethical issues. I think there's more likelihood for better, but I don't think it's a guarantee.
Yes. No. Well, not at a surface level. But, years ago, like John Kabat-Zinn, who I'm sure is your good friend, and is an old friend of mine from even before he became like such a major force after being on Bill Moyer's. He was always, we got along really well, and I always thought that it's a wonderful thing that mindfulness divorced itself from any religious setting or any spiritual thing, because as a formally spiritual thing, because by itself, if human awareness increases of where you are and what you're doing, you automatically will do that better, because you'll be more aware of the consequences of what you're doing. And I think a lot of the negative things that happen come because, for example, you said ethical. If you do a lot of unethical things on a regular basis, then this eats at you and it makes you more, it'll get you in another way and you'll become ill, actually, in the long run, I believe. And so if you're more aware of what's happening to you, then that will help you to make better decisions, because they will eat at you less if you do good things rather than bad things. In other words, you'll become more aware of the feedback loops without imposing an ethical structure on it. People know when they're causing harm, and they know when they're causing less harm. They know that, don't you think?
I do. I think I do. I absolutely agree with that. I think it's also true in the motivation. One of the main motivations for me deciding to make this big move from General Mills to, this nonprofit institute for mindful leadership was because I saw in the market, in my organizations I worked with, also in the nonprofit organizations I worked with in the Twin Cities, that the best leaders are these people with bright minds and really good hearts, and they were overwhelmed and they were on autopilot way too often, and they were feeling just like there was no choice. We just got to get on this treadmill and we got to be on this hamster wheel thing, and there's no way around it. And so it really began out of a sense of, I had seen over a period of about 5 years before I had the courage to actually come out of the closet.
But when you were still there, right?
Oh yeah, I was still there.
You're using influence there. Oh yes, I was going to ask about that. Yes.
So, but what was happening was I pretty quickly, almost within weeks after I came back from that retreat with John, I began to see these two threads in my life intertwining. So the one thread was this practice that had now become a very big part of every part of my everyday.
Yeah.
The second one was something that I had been nurturing and building for more than 25 years, which was, how do we develop great leaders? How do I develop my own leadership better? How do I help all the people in my department, in my company, all the people I mentored over all that time, develop great leadership, the kind of leadership we aspire to as human beings, kind of influence we want to have with our lives, influence with meaning, with purpose, with compassion, and also with intellect and strategic understanding and innovation and all the rest. And I started to see how those two things were intertwining, and they were changing my own leadership in pretty profound ways. And it started to snowball to the point where I could also see all the ways we're creating our own suffering, we were creating our own exhaustion, and I couldn't keep it a secret anymore. I had to tell the people I cared so much about, my colleagues at that organization, something about what I'd been discovering.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So that was kind of the early motivation. It was really around, how do I make this something that didn't sound religious, that didn't sound like California tree huggers, that didn't sound, like I was going to
solve that. That's wonderful. Yes.
So that was the question of how do I put these things together. And I started to look at the things that I felt were what I call fundamentals of leadership excellence. And again, not leadership for the C-suite, but leadership for all of us. How do we all become the best influencers we can be? And there are 4. One is focus. And as you know, that's a pretty easy one to strengthen, right, with practice. That's an easy one.
Absolutely.
The second one is clarity. And so in the workplace, how do I keep clarity, which means I have to start learning something about unconscious bias. I have to learn something about my own filters. I have to learn something about how being on autopilot keeps me from having clarity, including my ability to connect to my colleagues. What's getting in the way of that? So focus, clarity. The third one is creativity, innovation. How do we cultivate the mind's innate capacity to have the spaciousness necessary for creativity and innovation? And the last one was compassion. And compassion as we use it here, as I teach it, is really about deep understanding.
Yes.
And when we bring all 4 of those things together, we have great leaders.
Yeah.
And so the challenge for me then became because those come from my work of leadership. What do we need for great leaders? And they come from my understanding of, well, how can some of these practices and trainings strengthen all 4 of those fundamentals of excellence? And that's what my curriculum's about in a nutshell.
That's really fantastic. So what was the clarity one about not being on autopilot, and also that means that being able to listen and to not just promote your own perspective, but to be open to seeing things from other perspectives. The clarity involves that.
Yes.
Is that would you say that's correct?
That is correct. Absolutely correct. And clarity also not only requires us to communicate in a very different way, and particularly in the workplace, in meetings.
Yeah.
Those are the most dysfunctional things ever invented, were business meetings.
I really don't like them. You have them in academia, in departments.
Right.
And it's so, people are so worried about how they're being perceived. And then the aggressive ones dominate, whether they know what they're talking about or not, because they feel they better be noticed. And then the ones who other people sort of hang back. And it's really, so how do you deal with that in specific? How did you begin to deal with that in that time?
Right. So we do two things. The first thing we invite folks to do is with a single other person to engage with a question around, and we first do a reflection. I'll guide a reflection about leadership principles. So if I say to many people, and in fact, I had a CEO of a major aeronautics company say this to me about this reflection. First of all, I invite them to explore, what are my leadership principles? What are mine? Not what I read in a book, not what the company told me they should be, but what's at the core of me in terms of how I want to influence with my life. And so we do some reflection work around that and some journaling. I invite people to write it. And then in a pair, just with one other person, I invite them to explore that with their partner, but do it in a particular way. And the particular way is monologue. So I give people, you have 4 minutes to tell your partner what you discovered during that reflection, whatever you care to share, about what came up for you, what arose for you in this reflection about leadership principles. And then I'm going to invite you to obviously reverse roles. And if you are the listener, and this is the hardest part for many, if you are the listener, in that time frame, those 4 minutes, you are the listener, your job is just to listen, which means you don't even say, oh yes, me too, or oh, I agree with that, or I have a question, or you say nothing. You make eye contact, you can nod your head occasionally, but you got to pay attention to that so you don't become the dog in the car window, And so that sent very simple first touch into what is it like to speak from the heart, to have the space all yours so you don't feel like somebody's going to interrupt me, so I better talk really fast. There's no masks involved here. It's just you and your partner. Speak what's true for you. Speak the truth. That's the first simple entree into what is it really like to connect and communicate, to listen deeply, to allow things to arise and trust that what's arising is what is here for you, what is true for you.
Right.
And from that, I then offer, after much, we have quite a bit of dialogue. We have a couple of experiences with that. So people start to get a little, because as you can imagine, it's really uncomfortable for people at first. And then if they allow themselves to be with what's there, and most do pretty quickly, they'll say, oh my gosh, it was such a relief to just listen. It was such a relief to really, for the first time, say everything I wanted to say instead of just a bit. So then we turn it into, how do you take that into a meeting? How do you have a mindful meeting? How do you take what you've learned and now what would it look like? And we talk around the process of what would it be like to try that? How could you try that with a group of 10 people? And one way, and there are a number that come up, but one of the most common ones is you send the question out in advance. This is what we want to talk about. We want to hear from everyone because all of you are equally important to this resolution. At the meeting, we're going to give everybody 2 or 3 minutes to say what came up for you. What's your solve, or what's your idea, or what's your concerns, whatever the question is. And no one is going to interrupt until everyone has spoken for 2 or 3 minutes.
That's so good. I love that. You know, I have a department of 19 or 20 people. I chaired it 2 times.
Mm-hmm.
I did try to put out an agenda, and I did try to get the ones who don't speak, but it was very difficult because certain elder ones, they just hold forth.
That's right.
And everyone, you know, and then it's very difficult to do that. And then this would be the key. In order to have done that better, which I didn't really get to do, I sort of did here and there, but in order to do it better, I guess you have to have a label for that, like how you would say, well, now we want to have a different kind of meeting. And how did you do that in General Mills when you were starting to do this?
Yeah, a mindful meeting. A mindful meeting.
You called it that in General Mills?
Absolutely, we called it a mindful meeting, yeah.
Really?
And the other thing that becomes really important, I had to come up with, you know, so let me back up a minute. When I first started teaching mindful leadership, I was still in my role at General Mills for years, for probably almost another 5 years. So I had my kind of first.
You were a vice president for ethics, and what was it?
I was a vice president, deputy general counsel. I'm a lawyer by training.
And deputy general counsel, right? Okay.
Right. And I also had the title of vice president for public responsibility. So, right. Okay. So because I had that role, and because I'd been at General Mills for a lot of years, when I first started to decide, okay, I'm going to try and see if I can make this something that people might be
coming out of the closet. Coming out of the closet.
Coming out of the closet. And it actually
to keep your, I'm sorry to go, but you were able to keep your personal practice every day.
Every day.
Even when in the closet. You didn't lose it, you know,
yes.
That's really good. You know.
Yes.
That's
well,
really
for
good.
Sure. I pretty quickly, if I missed a day, like if I was traveling or something, but if I missed a couple of days, I would feel it. I would begin to feel the difference. Sure. Yes. And then along the way, because I didn't have anybody locally, I started to reach out. And so I did some training with a wide variety of teachers.
Yeah.
Sharon Salzberg, Joseph Goldstein, Mingyur Rinpoche. Over the year, I like little this, that, and everywhere.
Excellent.
So that's how there was not a single influence. It was just lots of people. Saki Santorelli, John was also, so lots of people over the years. I seem to be, and then lots of reading, including your books. So a combination of things. But anyway, the day, there was a single moment when I made the out of the closet choice. And it honestly was because I couldn't not do it. That's what it got to. It got to the place where I just could, because there's a lot of risk, honestly, a big career risk to me to come out of the closet. And so there was a lot of reason to keep my practice, change my own leadership, have my little ripple effect. And the day was, we had gathered all of our officers together for an entire day to explore innovation.
Aha.
We wanted to increase innovation. And so we had, big undertaking to pull all these officers together and say, okay, today, this entire day, we're going to dedicate to innovation.
Yes.
How do we increase innovation? And they had a consultant, and we were going through all this stuff, and nothing much was happening.
Yes. And
then one of my very good colleagues, a senior officer, had enough, and he stood up and he said, it's not that we don't have lots of ideas here. We have great people they're smart, they have lots of creativity, but here's what happens. We sit around a big table and we're going to look for some solve to a problem or some new way of doing something. And somebody says, well, what about, and before the words even get to touch the table, 5 other people have said, oh, that was tried 5 years ago. We don't have funding. We'll never get approval. It dies before it ever has a chance to see. A little seed might have something there. It just, it just shuts everything off. And in that moment, to me, all that he was describing in my parlance had become what I had learned about myself and what I'd seen in others, which is storytelling. We have to help people see that their thoughts are just thoughts, may or may not be true. They don't, you know, they're not concrete. What arises between my ears is not solid and true and me. And that was a big piece. That was a big motivator of, I got to try and see if I can.
So what did you say? Can you remember? How did you intervene?
Not in that meeting, but what happened was the very next day, I started to randomly, literally, as I would walk through the hall, if I saw a colleague that I thought might be someone, oh, that person might be receptive to this. I went over and I said, can I tell you about something that I've been exploring for the last few years that has really changed my leadership and that I think could be helpful for you?
I see.
And I'd say it involves mindfulness meditation. And the responses I got shocked me. The responses I got was, oh, that's what's been so different about you these last few years. It's been amazing. And that was why they said, okay, I don't know what you're talking about, but sure, I'm in. And that's what it was.
Oh, good.
So that was how.
Yes, you had convinced them by your changed behavior and changed presence over some years, actually, before you kind of popped that.
Right.
That's really wonderful. That shows the difference between a sort of zealot and a person who's really sharing a benefit, you know, rather than that, you know, take it or leave it sort of thing. This is me, you know, it's so wonderful. It's heroic. Brilliant.
So, well, it was surprising to me. And then what was even more surprising was I had great faith that because I had so much respect for these individuals who were in these roles, these professionals who were working themselves to death, who really wanted to do a good job, who were interested in the society, in the community, and just, you know, overwhelmed and just needed some space. And I had great faith that if this touched them, if this work touched them, that what they would be able to do is what I call the win-win-win. Make more often the decisions that the first win is good for the company because the company employs people and we got to keep it healthy so people have jobs and their families have food and all that.
Sure.
Good for the employees themselves so that the employees benefit from decisions as well. And the last one is good for the community, good for the big picture. And when you take great leaders and you help them not feel overwhelmed and on autopilot and you connect them again to their principles, that's when that magical win-win-win has the best chance of happening, that influencing for better.
Fabulous.
So that was it. The other thing I'll say, which has been really hard and to this day is hard, and in fact, I'd love to get your thinking on this because it gets harder and harder, it seems, every day. The other thing I was very committed to because I understand what it's like to be in those fire leadership positions, that if it wasn't profoundly strong touch, that it wouldn't stick and the potential would not be seen. And so as a result of that, I never taught short bubblegum versions. So this very first group of 13 officers and directors from General Mills went on a 5-day retreat.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's a huge intervention there.
Yes.
Wow.
And my faith was shown at the end of that because within a week, one of the most senior people was in my office saying, I want everyone in my division to have an opportunity to learn this from you, but I can't send everybody away on a 5-day retreat. So what else have you got? And so that was the challenge there too of, okay, well, I don't want to just teach people about the breath. I want to teach people about focus and clarity, creativity and compassion. So how do I do that? And so what I did then was take the curriculum and develop it into a 7-week and done in the workplace at the end of the day, right in the room with zafus and zabutans, by the way.
What?
With zafus and zabutans. So we had
into the office.
Into a conference room. We pushed back the tables and put the cushions on the floor. We also had chairs because not everybody wants to sit on a cushion and it's not necessary. But I wanted them to have the option.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that was kind of the beginnings. There's a, and so for 5 years, just about 5 years, I was teaching retreats, 5-day retreats, 7 weeks. I held weekly sessions which were drop-ins for people who had learned and wanted to keep going. And every single thing that was developed was a pull. It was never a push. So another example was people who'd been on retreat. They'd come to the weekly drop-ins, which were just an hour because it was like early in the morning, just before work or, And people would say, but we can't get to the really good stuff in an hour. So can we do something longer? And so we started to do what I called, not very creatively, extended sessions. And we would do them. We started out doing them once a quarter. We ended up moving them up because they wanted more to every month. And we literally, whoever wanted to that month, would go to someone's house nearby and we'd go spend 3 hours. And there would be a chance for me to introduce some new stuff, to do some more dialogue, to go deeper into things.
Oh, great.
And
really great. So then what you did that for, so you went after, you had 5 years there just regular. Then you did the retreat yourself. Then
no, with Saki Santarelli. Saki was the person who helped. I don't know if you know Saki Santarelli.
Right. Yeah, no, I do. I don't think I've met him, but I think I know that. I just retiring from Colombia, which kept me locked down quite a lot of the year, so I didn't circulate that much. And then I'm writing and so on. So I'm just trying to get the spacing of where, when you first moved there, you were gung-ho on the straightforward thing under the stress for a few years. Then you had the retreat after the tremendous adjustment, you're taking a break.
Yes.
Then you kept it in the closet for a few years.
Yes.
Although you yourself were changing gradually and your impact was being felt subliminally, let's say. Then that meeting happened, and then you got the first team, and then you started expanding for a few years. So if we're talking 10, 12 years, this whole process. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And then another few years after that, it's becoming quite widespread in the corporation culture. But then you decide to move to the Institute. So what is that trigger that causes that? Did you hit a wall of resistance at a certain stage? Or did you feel this has done so much good here, I want to do it in other places? Or can you explain that one?
Sure.
I'm sorry. I'll answer any question you have, but I'm so fascinated by it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So what happened is I had started just teaching these retreats at General Mills, and then these 7-week courses and these extended sessions and the weeklies, all that. But then the people at General Mills, these are senior people, and now it had moved now into all the different levels at the General Mills as well. Yeah. But the senior people started to tell other senior people outside of General Mills, we do this great thing. And so then we opened the retreats up to like leaders who are friends of General Mills leaders. So other companies were coming in now.
Right.
Now I started to spend so much of my time between, I did a lot of writing while I was still at General Mills. So if I had a conversation or something came up at one of the classes or something like that, I would share it with people or give them some writing that I had done or somebody else's writing. So they were getting like weekly emails from me. And so this was growing beyond, it really was mindful leadership, much beyond meditation itself, because it was, some of those writings were about how do you handle difficult conversations that are going to be coming up?
Yeah.
I remember vividly having one extended session where for the first time in like 40 years, General Mills was going to have to do some layoffs. And they had never happened in anyone's who was their memory, because that wasn't just, they had run into something and they had to do a small number, but it was really painful to these people who had now been on this mindful leadership journey, many of them for years. So we have this extended session and I could feel it. I could feel the unrest. I could feel that people were struggling with all of it.
Right.
And we had some practice and then we had dialogue, and you heard very experienced leaders saying, I can't do what HR wants me to do here. Not that I understand that there are people and we don't have jobs for them anymore and we're going to have, but I can't read this script. And I don't know if you've ever been a part of that, but you know, when there's HR gives you a script, this is what you say, you know, this is how you answer these questions. And people were saying, I can't do this. It really is so dissonant to me, making me feel so we got into this engaged conversation around, well, what would resonate with you? How would you, what would you say? What's important to do here? And this is where all that mindful communication training came in. And we ended up with some really beautiful suggestions that people just organically came up with of how do you do this in a way that's compassionate and respectful and also gets the job done. It's not like we're, you know, we won't do it. That wasn't on the table. But how do you do it in a way that is aligned with what is here for each of us?
Right.
So at the time though, but back to, I was spending so much of my time, vacation time, teaching outside, teaching, you know, that I basically had 2 full-time jobs. And it started to feel like that time when I was doing the Pillsbury acquisition for General Mills, where I was flat out, and now I remember. Now I was like, yeah, you can't sustain 2 full jobs. Something has to go. Something has to change. And people would later say to me, that must have been such a hard decision, but it was not. It was the simplest of decisions. There was no decision to make.
Yes. So I can see how it happened naturally. It's great too. I think it's so great. I really do.
So that was a big leap off the cliff though, because I had no idea when I left General Mills, mindful leadership were not words that were in the parlance. You know, mindfulness had not come into the business community until I brought it in General Mills, and it generally was nowhere. And then mindful leadership was absolutely nowhere. So to start a nonprofit institute for mindful leadership was kind of jumping off the cliff, because I'm like, does anybody want this? I don't know.
Johnny Kabat-Zinn was already doing it quite successfully though, wasn't he? So was he part of your institute right away? Is he part of your institute or he?
No, he was doing MBSR, but that's very, very, very different from what we.
Of course. More in the head, starting out in Worcester and everything. Yes, and I took Tibetan doctors for grand rounds in Worcester. I sort of do know a little about that.
Right.
I see. So you were really pioneering then this way. That's really wonderful.
Well, it was scary.
One tiny other thought. Is the thing that happened that involved the layoffs for General Mills, is there any sense that corporate loss or corporate retrenchment that occurred had to do with General Mills executives becoming too soft or too aware or making decisions that were too something? Is there any sense that feeling that maybe if they'd done something more cutthroat or something, they wouldn't have had that situation?
I don't think so. I don't think there was ever any of that, because I don't think that's really what happens.
I see. I have no idea myself. Are they doing well now as a company? Do they do strongly or?
Well, they go up and down, like most organizations. I don't really buy into the idea that this is going to increase productivity or it's going to.
I don't either, but I can see it. I can see it as a point of resistance in some quarters. You know, some people would think. You know,
you're right.
It's a very people are afraid if they're too compassionate. For example, they completely connote weakness and compassion. You know, they wrongly connote that as a product of compassion, weakness, and even cool heroism, which, you know, my original elaboration of that phrase came from a moment where I realized when someone was asking me when my theory of cool heroism, where were the cool heroes in the world today? And who can you point to? Sort of thing, Gandhi or who? You know, the Dalai Lama, well, he's a loser. Gandhi got shot, Martin Luther King got shot, you know. And then, of course, I had this eureka moment in that interview where the cool heroes are the women in every family, 100%. And just thinking of my own different families, you know, my birth family and my other family. And, you know, the males get out of control sometimes, you know, sons and brothers and fathers and etc. And the women are in the middle of it and they calm it down and often get caught in the crossfire, you know. So, I mean, I had this thing. So I'm saying, but then again, the female, oh, she'll be too soft. She won't be able to make money. Business is hard, you know, etc. That's a whole thing you have to cope with, that wrong reaction, right?
Well, and I think, yes, absolutely. And there are some, but I do think you're seeing it in a couple of places. First of all, I love your cool heroism as women. And I think if you look at the state of politics in the last couple of years, it is as if it had to push to the point where now women said, enough already. You know, like,
I know.
We're gonna take this on now because enough.
They have to sustain it. So I just saw this morning that someone said, or I heard that there's a big billboard on the LA freeway that says, "One sexual predator on the Supreme Court is enough." I believe Anita Hill.
Oh my gosh!
It's just a little bit late.
It was horrific. And of course they've been showing what happened to her, of course, with all the clips on the news and replaying it all. And every time I look at it, it just makes me stomach sick. Like what they did to her was just horrific. And I'm wondering if they're going to be better this time with this professor. And if nothing else, if you think about why would she do this? If you take everything else away, what is possibly her motivation for putting herself and her family through this if it wasn't true? If she wasn't being driven by principle that said, I can't sleep at night if this person becomes a Supreme Court justice and nobody knew that he did this.
Yes. I know. She's very brave. She's a cool hero for sure.
For sure. Yeah, cool that's hero. A cool hero. Yes.
That really is, you know. And they're already giving out her address and phone number and attacking her in the most completely outrageous. They should be arrested. Anyway, I don't want to get off on that. I'm so thrilled. No. I'm so thrilled to meet you and to learn about it. It really gives hope. Wonderful.
Well, really
wonderful.
So one of the I'm gonna take us back to my question, if it's okay with you.
Sure.
Because I really would love to get your thoughts and ideas and things. So sticking to this sense that it's one thing, yes, you can introduce people in general to something and have a half a day thing and they can kind of taste it. But if we really, there are folks out there now and everybody's doing it. Right? Yeah. Everybody's teaching this now, which I'm always intrigued by because I was terrified. I had no interest in teaching this. I didn't want anything to do with it. And, but anyway, and then they boil it down to such simplicity that I feel like that's a threat to what is the potential wonderful possibility here.
Yeah.
And the reason, particularly in the business world, is if you boil this down to, it's just a 5-minute app. You don't need to do the hard work. You don't need to spend time. You don't have to 5 minutes will do you. And then, of course, then you hear from people, well, nothing really happened. Yeah, you know, I take a breath for 5 minutes, but
I know.
transformation doesn't happen.
Right.
And then they become less open to it because they think it's a fad or it's just about their health. And for me, and this is my own frustration sometimes, my own passion sometimes, is I think the best hope that we have as a society is to help people who are among our best and brightest and most educated and have access to resources to be their best selves.
Yeah.
Because if they can be their best selves and they know how to get things done, that's where the solves come from, not the NGOs, not the government. So that's what gets me up in the morning. I believe that. I've seen it happen.
Wonderful. No, I completely agree with you. And I'm so happy. You know, I recall a story. Makes me think of a story of someone who was in the earlier stage. I would say probably before you came out and before you emerged as publicly as you have and powerfully as you have. Someone did a retreat for some executives at one of the very nefarious corporations. This is much worse in its behavior than almost any other one. And for 25 executives, vice presidential, I think, level, and then used to go around within the circle of people involved with the Dharma, you know, talking proudly about how after that retreat, that intensive, which was a bit longer, but it was also a little bit mixed with some work, so there wasn't a complete retreat. But anyway, they said that half of them resigned, and those people, you know, said that as if it were a triumph. And you know, the people who reported that, and I never liked that.
Yeah.
Because I think it's much more important. I love the respectful way you talk about the people who are your colleagues and who you first got to be. Not only, you know, point is they're very deeply unhappy in the stress-ridden, bad decision-making sort of personality habit that is inculcated, if you know, in the you know, DeVos family, this, you know, in the Protestant ethic, Max Weber, whatever you want, deferred gratification, etc. Phillips Exeter, like where I went, you know, and they, you know, homework till 3 a.m, you know, and then sports teams, and then compel and exceed and elbow the other person out of the way, and this whole thing, leading to the destruction of their earth, and miserable life for them all, you know.
Right.
And so the point is, people who have fought their way up like that, even in a negative place, the only hope is to have them become happier and then try to change the negative place, not run away from it as if, you know, it's ever, you know, despair, you know, that means they didn't really they didn't have the proper teaching, as you clearly are giving here: clarity, creativity, compassion. It's really wonderful. And, you know, then again, there are other people who are on the sort of religious side of this kind of meditation and things. And they are all snotty about, oh, this and that, and an app, or, you know, meditating, or just selling out to corporations. They're totally wrong. Because Buddha himself, he was walking around and he was not selling a religion. He was rebelling against the Vedist religion that was the dominant religion at that time. There was no Buddhist religion. And he was just saying, take a look at your life. What are you doing with it? What does it mean? What is it? Focus, you know, develop clarity, creativity, and innovate, you know, and don't just be like a cipher in the machine of the caste system at whatever your role is assigned to be. And in the case of women, people wrongly think he was somehow chauvinist because he hesitated to form the women's community. But he didn't say it was because there's anything wrong with them. He said, actually, they're better than the men. And the problem is they're more oppressed, so they'll come out more powerfully. And then the men won't tolerate the whole thing, you know. So
Interesting.
that was his reason. And then he, of course, he caved and he said, sure. And there was a stampede, and his sociological prediction was correct. After about 1,000 years, they started, the men, by the Gupta dynasty, the men started shutting it down because the women are too enslaved by them. They didn't like them having a place to escape to. So only then later did it become, people think of it as a religion, but it doesn't fit the definitions of religion, which are mainly a belief system and some authority thing where you're ordered to do this and that. It's completely against that. So actually what you are doing, and John Kabat-Zinn and others in the field, are the real thing, which is not asking people to join your club, to pay dues and to be under your authority. You're asking them to review their own life and try to make their own good common sense their authority by becoming more aware of what it is, Like I always tell people, if you do that, even the tiniest bit, when your mind wanders away from your breath and you learn to dismount from a distracting memory stream or anticipation stream or contemplation, thinking stream, and you learn to dismount a stream of thought, a train of thought, get off the train. That means you're beginning to see the multiple sources of control within your own mind, and you're less controlled by any particular train of thought, like what you said about the listening thing and not just following whatever your thought is, but that has to be the absolute thing, This wonderful phrase that I'm sure many people have said it, but I heard it from Thupten Chodron, the very nice nun who has a place in Washington State. She said, don't believe everything you think.
I love that.
I like it. But I'm sure a lot of people have said that. But the point is, it's finding, instead of being therefore controlled by your habitual, identity bearing, self, you begin to find more openness in yourself, and you begin to see that you can make it, you're free internally with your own reactions and things. And then this immeasurably improves your life and your relationships and everything. And that's really what it's about. And once you do that, then you will make better decisions and you will be better, because you'll be happier yourself. You'll be less driven and by some weird, who's driving you? Max Weber, like German sociologist from the early 20th century, or what, So yep. Calvin, poor Calvin, driving everybody, I'm sure the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. I'm sure you know that book. But that's a deep book that these people should read, really. Because what it shows is that the original creativity in capitalism came out of generosity, actually, and detachment, monastic economics, where you have a vow of poverty and yet you create great wealth with your creativity just for the world, and you live a certain way. That's the source of the Protestant ethic, really. It isn't being whipped and driven to just beat your enemy up and beat your competitor up. That's not at all the source of it.
And I think that there is a growing, and I think it's going to be around for a long time, because it's the whole generation of like my kids, your kids, and me, that like the kids in their 20s and 30s, they are interested in purpose-driven work.
Yeah.
And they are less likely than my generation to be as afraid to not make money. I think some of that has been foreclosed to them because of the economics and the situation they are in, changing from the current kind of society we are into a very different kind. We're sort of in that next evolution, and people don't want to go there. I mean, there's a whole big segment that want to go backwards and not recognize that things have to change. And so as a function of that, I think that generation realizes that they, in some ways, have a lesser financial outlook than their parents because there are less opportunities for them.
Yeah.
And they seem to be substituting that for that, this drive to have purpose-driven work and to also be less driven personally themselves. To do this crazy 24-hour constant working kind of thing. And I see enough of that it gives me some hope that maybe that is all part of this change.
It is. You're on the front edge of the wave. No question about it. Although, you know, I think that they also do want to be able to make money. And the point is, the reason there is no money is not because there is no money, but it is because it's been so badly corrupted and mismanaged by people driven in the wrong way that they've hoarded it in some horrible way where it's not being used. And there's a few enlightened people, fortunately. And I think that it had to reach a particular nadir where we are. Although I have to say, you're younger than me, a lot younger. But, you know, we used to say, couldn't get worse than Nixon. Couldn't get worse than Reagan. Couldn't get worse than Bush's 1 and 2. And of course, so now we're saying couldn't get worse. But I think we really have reached, it's not possible to be worse than this. And so I think it's stirring people up. And particularly, I think the cool heroes are being stirred up. And they are the key here, I think, really. In fact, this next November 8th, if they pursue it with the energy that they did on January 22nd, 2017 in Washington, if they pursue it with that energy and those numbers were, you know, nationwide, I think things will start going in the right direction slowly. You know? And I think everyone knows it. That's why the blue meanies, let's call them, to use an ancient phrase from the Beatles, the blue meanies are so desperate right now, and they're doing these crazy things. You know, as someone said today, any sane president on this happening would simply withdraw the nomination and find a new person from the Federalist Society who's less extreme than this particular lunatic, you know. And you know, that would just be a matter of course, would be an obvious decision just to save him, even the embarrassment, even the nominee, you know. But the desperation of them, the desperation is what is doing it, you know.
Well, anyway, and you also have to look at the ego of Kavanaugh, because if I were him, I would be certainly considering withdrawing myself so I don't put my young girls through listening to this kind of thing about their father and all of that.
Well, you know, he's a fanatic. He thinks he can. There was a cartoon on Daily Kos which was called Kavanaugh Tells the Truth. And he turned into this like monstrous thing about all the nasty things he's going to do. You see that he wants to get to a place where he can do it, he thinks. But it was quite shocking, actually. It was a very good cartoon on the Daily Kos, you know. That
okay.
Anyway, but I don't want to go into politics. It's just although I do want to say this: your institute. Let's just imagine that your institute gets a contract in the 2 to 4 years from now to go in and hold your special dialogues and retreats and things for a newly constituted cabinet.
Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful?
And
it'd be fabulous.
Mandatory for the people in the departments of energy and this and that and defense and everything that they develop this way of everybody gets a chance to talk and everybody says this and the president and vice president moderate and are listening and etc. Mrs. President gets to listen. Let's hope. And imagine that, whoever it is, you know. And then this goes down and the State Department, and you can't handle the business, you know, and you clone others and the other people will also help. And that's really critical. And because the point is, I'll never forget in the 70s, meeting people from the Jerry Brown first gubernatorial time. It's sort of enlightened people, the whole earth catalog type of people. Mm-hmm. And having them explain how, once they got in, and all the phone calls and the meetings and the thing, and they sort of weren't able to get at all to what their vision was, because the way that the position was defined and the stress and pressure thing that they were supposed to deal with put them at the mercy of all kind of lobbyists and money interests and all that kind of thing, and they were not making good decisions very soon, because they were up 18, 19, 20 hours a day, and of course they didn't have mindfulness going for them at the time, and we would talk about it. People like me would mention it, and that would be labeled as Buddhism. That's some weird thing. We're Californians. We're in the hot tub. Can't do that in the hot tub. But of course you can.
Of course you can.
Exactly. So that's really great. What is the time? What is our time now? Yeah, are we overrunning time? I don't want to take too much.
I'm okay. I'm okay if you're okay. Yeah.
I'm okay. So I just don't think we should rule out government, and we shouldn't rule out anything. And Europe in a way has a social culture that is more open to this theory. I think they're behind us a little bit in practice, maybe, because they haven't been as bad off, actually, as we have. But I can see this. I'm sure this will be the mode before I die. This will be much more widespread. So take heart. I hope your institute is doing really well.
Well, as I said, our challenge is really to help get help people hear that this is about more than feeling your breath. I mean, what's being lost, to me, oftentimes, is the insight piece. It's becoming, in some places, it's becoming a tactic or a tool, as opposed to a way of evolving ourselves or learning more about our own potential, both individually and as a community.
Sure.
And that's the piece that I really want to, I'm always looking for new ways to help people hear that and take it in without it sounding, I don't want to sound like a salesperson, when I do it.
I know. Well, that's always the danger, but it's like yoga. I always try to say that even if, 80% of the men who go practice some yoga are hoping to pick up a date rather than actually learn something. Nevertheless, once they start realizing about the stiffness in their joints and the tensions behind their kneecap and all of this and the potential of arthritis or whatever, and if then they're only doing it for a little health, a little like macho thing. But then they start beginning to realize their lack of inner experience and inner sensitivity. And then they will begin to look for things. So even dipping their toe in some way that's sold to them for much less than it could be, it will also automatically, even just hearing that other voice in your own mind, that, gee, I have a voice that can make a judgment between reacting this way or that way in this situation. I have an awareness that can do that. Wow, I have this a little bit of inner freedom emotion. I don't have to be just the way I am.
Right.
As people like to say when they're reveling in being stuck, or using it as an excuse. And so I think I'm not too worried about that personally. I think that's really, it's a danger, but it's important, But it's really.
And one of the things that when it was John who pushed me to write Finding the Space to Lead, right? So I'm the reluctant person all around, right? I was very reluctant to teach this. I was reluctant to, and then John, I was on the advisory board for the Center for Mindfulness for years. And every time I'd go to the board retreat, there'd be an annual board retreat. And every time I'd go to the board retreat, I'm still, the VP at General Mills. So I'm bringing strategic, corporate, that's my contribution to these things. And every time he'd see me, because I'd already been teaching for a couple of years in General Mills, the retreats and courses, and developing that curriculum. Every time he'd see me, he said, "Where's the book?" And I was like, "I'm not an author. I don't write books. I'm not writing books. I'm just doing this little thing over here." And the next year, "Where's the manuscript?" And after a couple of years of that, he said, "Okay, you could teach every day from now till you die, and you won't touch as many people as if you write it down and tell people that this can happen."
Yes.
So that was guilting me to write a book. So it turned into like, if you really care about this, then write a book. So then my challenge became, how do I write a book of service to people like me who are like closet meditators or not so sure, and how do I make it clear and make it practical? And so that's, and it was named after those early adopters at General, those very brave people who jumped off the cliff and without knowing what the heck they were getting into, went off with, into the Wisconsin woods for 5 days to learn something about something that they didn't know what it was, except they saw something different. And so what I kept asking them, they, like me, as a, from all outside views, all of us were successes, right? From all the ways that society judges us, we had great careers. We were in a company that was a good company. We were making money. We were, right? Success. And yet, even with people would tell us, "Oh, you did a great job on that, or that project, or this, or that worked out well, or whatever," there was a nagging sense, and I had this in myself, but I kept hearing it from the people I was teaching, this nagging sense that it wasn't the best that I could have brought. There was something more I could have contributed.
Sure.
And then, of course, you distract yourself with the next project, and you didn't really pay a lot of attention. But when you stopped and we're doing this exploration of mindful leadership and those fundamentals, now you had something. So I started to ask others, and I started to take it as my own reflection work. What do you need? What do you need to be that person that you aspire to? That person that somehow inside is here, that wants to do more. What do you need? Okay. So in my role as a leader of departments, in my role as a lawyer, I would ask leaders that, what do you need to do a better job? And you hear the classic things like, "Oh, I need a bigger budget, I need more people, I need better direction." When I asked mindful leaders this, and when I took it into my own, but what I kept hearing from others was the same thing. What do you need? I just need some space.
Just what?
So my space.
Space.
Just need space.
Well,
and so that's why my book was named in honor of those folks, because that resonated with me too. Finding the space to lead. How do you do it in the midst of the distractions and the internet second speed and all the polls? How do you do it? How do you find the space to make that win-win-win choice?
That's right.
That ethical choice, that principled choice.
That's right. Well, that's your great book, right? Finding, what is it called?
Space to lead.
Finding the space.
Space,
the space to lead. Yeah.
To lead, the space to lead.
Right.
Well, I have your books on my to-be-read shelf, and I've read into them, but I allow myself to be too distracted and too busy. But I'm going to read them cover to cover now.
Oh.
No question. I really need them. I really need all of this.
Well, I would be honored if you would read even a little bit of it. So that would be good.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Well, and it was so much fun.
Thank you.
And thank you, Justin, for organizing it.
Hi, Justin. Nice to see you. I'll see you again in the spring. I'm coming back to teach my 5-day in the spring. So I'll see you then, Justin.
Okay. Oh, good. To Menla. Oh, great. Oh, good. Do you love Menla too?
I do love Menla. I've been teaching at Menla for 10 years, at least once a year for 10 years. Yeah.
That's right. Oh, good. Well, then that's my wife's masterpiece. That's her. She's creating that space for people. Nina, I don't know if you met Nina when you were there. I don't know if you did, but she's still the actual executive chairwoman is her, Although she reminds me, I have a friend who I serve on a nonprofit board with, who we must have you out actually, or one of your people to train that board actually. Anyway, he said a very funny thing. He's the executive chairman of his company now, a toy company. And he says, I'm the executive chairman, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, but I want you to know that being an executive chairman is like ruling over a cemetery. There's a lot of people below you, but no one is listening.
I love that.
I know. Alan Hassenfeld is his name. I should give him credit. Really wonderful.
That is fabulous.
The links
Okay, so I think we should. I think with that, we should conclude
the last questions?
interview. And I'm very deeply grateful, and I look forward to working with you. Maybe we could do an event together sometime somewhere. I don't know what you do or where you go.
I would absolutely love to do that. I would absolutely love to do that. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but one of the things that came from now the last 13 years, 12 years that I've been teaching are people asking for, yes, you teach my 5-day retreat is called Cultivating Leadership Presence. And they said, but we want a 2.0. So I've been racking my brains for a while, and I've always wanted to do another kind of deeper dive. So I invited Sharon to come, and we're going to teach a 4-day together. We've taught together before, but we're going to teach one called Deepening the Journey in October. And that's wonderful. We've got people from everywhere. But I would love to do something else with you at some point.
Someday. Awesome. Someday. I have too many things to finish before.
No, I know.
But anyway, I really loved it. I love you, and thank you so much for joining. It's
my pleasure. Can I ask you one more question?
Sure. Absolutely.
Not for the podcast, but outside of the podcast.
Okay.
So this is just you are such a deep expert on this whole area, and I have so deep respect for your work.
Thank you.
One thing that it's always on my mind from time to time. It's on my mind, and it's been on my mind forever, which is I don't have classical Buddhist training. I've studied with many Buddhist teachers, but I don't consider myself a Buddhist.
Right.
Things that arise for me to teach are just things that are arising, and they're things that are from this marrying up. And I have gone to talk to groups at their invitation and have been really attacked by folks who say what you do is a bastardization. And
no, that's totally wrong.
So I certainly wouldn't want to be. I never represent that I'm Buddhist or that I'm teaching Buddhism. That's not what I'm doing. You don't need to be Buddhist. But so it bothers me a little bit, and I always have this nagging sense that somehow I'm not real because I don't have that.
No, you're totally real. Well, let me tell you this, if that's the question.
That is it.
Holiness the Dalai Lama always tells people when he gives lectures in Europe or America or Australia or wherever, India, he says, I am not giving you this lecture and teaching in order to make you become a Buddhist. In fact, I really don't want you to become a Buddhist. And if you have a grandmother and you were brought up in a family with a certain religion, and you should keep your grandmother's religion, is what I believe, he said. And because if you don't, she'll be really upset. Mm-hmm. But you can learn stuff from us, like we can learn stuff from Christians and Muslims and Jews and Taoists and secularists even, which he considers like a world religion. And I think he overdoes that actually myself about the secularists, but never mind. And he said, and you can learn stuff and be better in whatever your religion is by your family, he said. And I've been telling the Pope and this Hindu Swami and that rabbi and forever, we don't, and Muslim sheikhs and ulamas, that we don't want people converting each other anymore. The modern world is such where the religion thing as an identity thing is dangerous. and especially if they're considered to be competing and each one is the only thing and all this. So by no means do I want to convert anybody to Buddhism. He says, but you can learn something. And the way I deal with that, I sometimes in some settings, I will say to His Holiness, who I've been his student and other Lama students and his student for 60 years now. Right? So I say, well, don't worry, Your Holiness, you didn't snatch me from my grandmother's religion because I didn't follow any such religion. I said, so I can say I'm a Buddhist, it's okay. But in another way, I have there is a deeper understanding of Buddhism, on the other hand, that I got His Holiness to agree to, but he doesn't push it publicly usually, which is that Buddhism is maximum 1/6 religious, the way religion is defined. For the people who really are educated in Buddhism. It can be all religious for people who are like farmers in ancient Asia who are plowing and they just want to support the monastery or pray to Buddha and they don't really have an understanding so much of it, but they feel something good is going on. They like the presence of the monks and etc. And so for them, you could say it's a religion because they just believe something. But for otherwise, it's about questioning your beliefs. But here's the key thing. The realistic worldview, which is the first branch of the Eightfold Path, is that the realism. It's thinking, taking as a possibility initially Buddha's assurance that reality itself is good, is goodness. That's what reality is, which goes against what authority systems will tell people. They always tell people that reality is dangerous and horrible. And therefore you have to follow that authority with some sort of God behind it or some sort of nihilist, safe nothingness behind it, in the case of the secularists. And then you'll be okay. But actually, other than that, reality is really bad. So just follow what they say. And whereas the Buddha, where his rebellion against religion in India was, reality is good, it's nirvana. The third noble truth is the only one that is real according to Buddha. The others are relative unrealities, which doesn't mean you can ignore them. You move within them to find the real reality, which is nirvana itself, which doesn't mean really he frustrated those more escapist, more psychotic ones who wanted to say nirvana is elsewhere, so I'm getting the hell out of this. He let them think that, and Theravada has it enshrined in a certain way, but he never really said that, and he even cautioned against it. And his non-dual teaching that this is nirvana if you understood what it was, if you were free of ignorance. This is nirvana right here. So listening to someone teaching compassion to corporate executives is a manifestation of nirvana, believe me. So what I'm saying is, if you gain faith in reality, that's taking refuge in the Dharma. If you respect the Buddha as a teacher of that reality, that's taking refuge in the Buddha. If you respect the community of people who have some sort of faith in reality and are trying to be realistic and practical, at whatever level, then that's taking refuge in the Sangha. So without changing religion, one can have a sense of having the three jewels in one's life, and one can see Jehovah as a force of infinite positive energy, however theologically different people have understood it. So then one can be a happy Jew, Christian, or Muslim. One can see Krishna as loving all beings, And, why the Buddhists, the Mahayana Buddhists, do see Avalokiteshvara as loving all beings, as that Buddhas love all beings 100%. They just don't think he created their difficult situation. If they feel it's a difficult situation, he tells them he did it, and that therefore he doesn't have omnipotence, but he does love them, and he does everything he can to arrange it where they can understand their reality. You see, so why on earth would a being who loves everybody, like Avalokiteshvara, or like the Dalai Lama, or the Karmapa, or somebody, why would he want people to say, "Oh, I am loved," but I used to be loved by Jesus or Moses or Buddha, which I knew their names, but now you have to tell me I'm loved by someone whose name I can't pronounce. What's the point? You see, that's not the case.
Right.
So you don't have to be Buddhist. And actually, you are totally doing Buddha's non-religious work, which is sort of therapeutic work. It's also political advocacy of kindness and compassion, that decisions can be made that benefit both sides. And so it's actually political and social work. It's a social revolution, a cool revolution. You're doing that work. And it was not convenient or even realistic to do that work by becoming a Jehovah's Witness type for Buddhism. That's completely stupid in a country that doesn't understand that, And even in a country that did, actually among Buddhists, it's probably like amongst some Buddhists in Burma, it would be very good to say, well, your version of Buddhism that's making you enemies of the Muslims is not proper, and you should be more human and humane and forget about it. And Buddha would be really miserable. You're using Buddhism like this. So you really shouldn't be guilty. You should not feel the slightest bit guilty. You can be indulgent of people who feel they've been saved by Buddha or something, that they would think, gee whiz, you're missing out on this. And you should say, well, I feel saved when someone I work with is more happy, and when they make better decisions and they make other people more happy, and that's when I feel good, and that's my religion. That's why Dalai Lama says he's 100% sincere. It's not just some sort of subterfuge, and there is a contradiction, because some of those lamas, well, they're creating Dharma centers and cults and things, and some of them we see go bad, actually. Some of them go sour because they get into this authority position and they abuse that. We've seen that, not all of them, but some. And so the point, Dalai Lama is not in favor of that, actually. He's really in favor of sharing the science of Buddhism, the inner science, the therapies, the compassionate strategies, meditational, possibilities, and kindling those things in the existing cultures that we have. Remember, Protestant ethic grew out of monasteries, and the Henry VIII and the North European nobles who adopted Calvin and those guys, they did it to grab the land and the wealth of the monasteries and the manpower of the monasteries, which they wanted them back in their armies, so they could start conquering things, So they destroyed that meditative thing that the West had, which was in the monasticism. And they even taught people to think that all monastics are bad, and they're all corrupt and everything, which is not true. Just because Luther couldn't meditate doesn't mean he couldn't successfully meditate. Doesn't mean that a lot of the Christian monks were not trying to do good things, and the nuns like Hildegard and Teresa, they were great people. And so anyway, please don't feel guilty. That's my answer to your question.
Thank you so much.
Be happy with what you do, and this. I did a series of lectures in the 80s in San Francisco, which should have been published by Parallax Press, but then they withdrew from it because it was called Buddhism Without Buddhism.
Oh.
And
great.
But that doesn't mean secularism, like certain other colleagues of mine try to sell secularism and say that's Buddhism. No, that is not the case. It means real spirituality without formal religious, conversion, and sharing whatever useful methods of living life more purposefully and more happily and more creatively that the Buddhist psychology and inner science can help with. There was no word for Buddhism in Buddha's time, absolutely no word for it, and they were leaving the Vedic ritual and the Vedic church service, and they were becoming more open to things. And then they liked the Vedas too, but they didn't like sacrificing animals, which they did in those times. And then later they influenced Hinduism with vegetarianism and all sorts of things, which was not at all. And then the Hindus today think it all came from the Vedas, but the Vedas were not at all vegetarian and nonviolent, not one bit. That really came from the kind of thing that you're doing. In fact, the Buddhists and the Jains and things like that, right?
Right.
So,
Thank you. Thank you.
Lots of love to you. Big hug.
Yes, big hug. Love is actually the real bottom line to all this stuff. That's why we do it, right? We feel the
That's it.
love. We offer love. That's the deal.
That's it.
That's the big deal. Thank you. Love to you. Bye.
This video was brought to you in part through the generous support of Tibet House US membership community and viewers like you. To learn more about the benefits of Tibet House membership, please visit tibethouse.us. Thanks for watching. Tashi Delek.